inquest lasted 4 days. 14 men went into Black Rock Mine on the morning of November 3rd, 1897. 5 came out. The other 9 were never recovered. Not their bodies, not their tools, not the lunch pails 3 of them had been carrying when they walked through the portal that morning. The Garfield County coroner filed his report on November 19th and listed the cause of death for all 9 as probable roof collapse and subsequent entombment, cause indeterminate. He wrote that phrase because he had no other category available to him. There was no gas signature. There was no evidence of explosion. No water ingress, no flooding, no black damp. The timbers at the main entrance were intact when the rescue party arrived. The oar rails were intact. The steam-driven ventilation fan at the portal was still running, turning steadily in the cold morning air. When the first rescuers came up the switchback trail the following dawn, 9 men vanished inside a functioning mine. I was one of the 5 who walked out. My name is Edmund Reese. I am 61 years old as I dictate this. In November of 1925, 28 years to the month since Black Rock closed, I served as assistant mine foreman at Black Rock. From April of 1895 until the morning of November 4th, 1897, which was the day after, and which was the day I filed my resignation with the company's Denver office by telegram and never returned to the valley. I've not spoken publicly about what happened inside that mountain in all the years since, because I did not believe I would be received as a credible witness. I still carry that doubt. But the men who were with me on November 3rd are dead now, every one of them. And I am the only living person who was inside that mine during the weeks preceding the incident, and the only one left who knows what the knocking actually was. Not what the inquest concluded. Not what the Black Rock Mining and Reduction Company told the families at the subsequent settlement meetings. What the knocking actually was and what it was doing, and why 9 men never came home. I will tell you everything in the order it happened. I am going to be precise, because precision is the only thing I have left to offer those men. Black Rock was a silver-bearing quartz operation in the mountains of western Colorado, situated in a narrow east-facing valley that the Ute had stopped using long before any white man filed a claim there. The vein had been located in the late spring of 1889 by a prospector named Callum Hess, who filed the original claim and sold the whole of it 18 months later to the Black Rock Mining and Reduction Company out of Denver for a sum I was never privy to. By 1895, when I joined the operation, it was a functioning mid-tier mine, not a Cripple Creek bonanza, not a marginal struggle, but a modest and consistent producer running between 80 and 100 tons of ore per month through the stamp mill at the valley floor. We employed between 30 and 40 men, depending on the season. Day shift ran from 7 in the morning until 5, with a brief stop for the lunch pail at noon. The men rose early enough to walk or ride from the bunkhouse at the bottom of the valley, arriving at the dry room beside the portal to change into their work clothes before descent. They wore canvas trousers tied at the ankle against the standing water in the lower passages, wool shirts in the colder months, felt hats hardened with linseed oil. Each man drew a numbered brass tag from the board at the portal entrance and returned it at shift's end the way you knew at a glance, in an emergency, who was still inside. They carried their lunch pails and their candle tins, their drill steels and their hammers, and they walked into the mountain as naturally as a man walks into his place of employment, because that is precisely what it was. The main adit ran 412 feet into the mountain before branching into 3 working drifts. The upper drift was a shallow exploratory passage that had been largely worked out by 1896. The middle drift was active, pulling moderate ore from a secondary vein that ran slightly east of the main body. The lower passage, which the men called the long drift, extended another 300 feet beyond the branch point on a slight downward grade, following the richest part of the primary vein. The long drift was where the best ore was and where most of our day's effort was concentrated. There was also a 4th passage, short and dead-ended, that we called the dogleg. It ran perhaps 40 feet off the main adit at an angle, bending left before terminating at a blasted rock face where the vein had pinched out. We had pulled the men out of the dogleg in early September. Once it became clear there was nothing more to take there, and had kept it timbered but unworked. It wasn't a significant passage. I barely thought about it in the normal course of a shift. I had come to Black Rock from the Sutro tunnel operation in Nevada, and before that from Cornwall, where my father had worked the Dulcoth tin mine, and where my earliest memories are of the smell of tallow candles and wet granite and the particular cold that a mountain gives off when it breathes against you. I had been underground since I was 14. I was 46 when I took the foreman post at Black Rock, and I had spent 32 years learning the difference between a mountain that is merely uncomfortable and a mountain that intends to kill you. I knew what stressed timber sounds like. I knew what bad gas smells like, long before it becomes detectable to an inexperienced nose. I knew the groan of a settling roof, and the crack of a failing post, and the deep, percussive thump that a wall makes when the pressure behind it is changing. I knew every sound a mine makes when it is healthy, and every sound it makes when it is not. I say this so that what I am about to describe is understood in its proper context. I was not a man given to imagination. I was not a man who frightened easily. When I tell you that what was happening in Black Rock Mine in October of 1897 was not a sound I had ever heard in 32 years underground, I am giving you the most considered and honest evaluation of my professional experience that I know how to provide. The crew on the day shift through October and early November of 1897 included men I trusted without qualification. Thomas Angarak, who was my lead miner, was a Cornishman from Cambourne, who had been underground since he was 12 years old, a broad, deliberate man, with hands that had been shaped by rock and hammer for 3 decades, and a manner of speaking that was measured to the point that when he said something, you listened. Angarak was not a man who embellished. Beside him on the Long Drift crew was Daniel Price, another Cornish emigrant and the finest powder man I have ever supervised. Price could read a rock face the way a physician reads a patient. He understood the mineral body it contained, the way the vein ran, the quality and character of what lay behind the stone. He had 20 years of underground work behind him, and the unhurried confidence that comes from it. There was Alexei Nowak, a Polish emigrant who had worked silver in Nevada for 6 years before coming to us a quiet man. Methodical, reliable in the way that a good instrument is reliable. Hector Brannigan, an Irishman of 51 who had never worked a surface job in his adult life and seemed genuinely puzzled that such jobs existed. Hector Marsh, 22, who was our youngest experienced miner and who had been underground since he was 15 in a Pennsylvania anthracite operation. These were not impressionable men. They were not prone to nerves. Their fear, when they finally showed it, meant something. The month of October 1897, which was the last full month of Black Rock's operation, was when the knocking began. I heard it first on a Tuesday afternoon in the 3rd week of October. The exact date was the 19th. I was inside the main adit, perhaps 60 feet from the branch point, doing a timber inspection. Most of the men were further in, working the long drift face. I had my oil lamp and my inspection hammer, and I was working my way methodically down the adit, pressing my knuckles against each timber set, listening for the hollow report that signals a post losing its bearing against the rock. Standard work. Work I had done hundreds of times. The sound came from the left wall, not from ahead of me where the men were, not from above. From inside the left wall at a point roughly between 2 timber sets in a section of solid granite that had been there untouched, unblasted since the mine opened. 3 knocks, a pause of perhaps 4 seconds. 2 knocks, a pause, 4 knocks. I stopped my inspection. I held my lamp up toward the wall and looked at it as if looking at it would help me understand what I was hearing, which of course it did not. The wall was stone, wet in places, the way granite weeps when the mountain above is carrying snow melt but solid. I pressed my palm flat against it. No vibration that I could detect, though the sound had passed. My first thought was the dogleg. The dogleg entrance was 20 feet further along the main adit from where I was standing, and I walked to it and held my lamp into the passage. Empty. The floor was undisturbed, that particular quality of undisturbed mine silt, flat and finely settled, showing no boot prints, showing no disturbance of any kind. No man had been in the dogleg since I last checked it 10 days prior. I went back to my inspection. I told myself it was the mountain singing the Cornish term for the sounds a rock body makes when it is under changing pressure. Thermal contraction as the autumn temperatures outside the mountain began to drop, the creaking and settling of stressed timber. In my 32 years underground, I had heard stone produce sounds that would alarm a layman and be completely explicable to a working miner. A mountain is not a static object. It moves, it breathes. It shifts against itself on a geological timescale that is invisible to human perception, but audible if you know what to listen for. 3 beats and 2 beats and 4 beats, this was almost certainly some version of that. Almost certainly. I finished my inspection and said nothing. 3 days later, on the Friday, Angarak found me before the morning shift started, while the men were still in the dry room pulling on their boots. He did not lower his voice, and he did not look particularly troubled. He simply mentioned it the way a careful man mentions something he has filed away and now intends to examine. "You hear the knocking in there recently?" "The 19th, I said. "From the left wall near the dogleg approach, you?" "Long drift," he said. "Yesterday, middle of the afternoon shift. South wall maybe 50 feet back from the face." "Not from the face, from the south wall." Came in 3 sequences and then stopped. I thought about the geometry of that. The dogleg ran off the main adit on the west side of the mountain. The long drift south wall was on the opposite side of the mine from the dogleg, nearly 400 feet away. If these were the same sound, traveling through the rocks, and sound travels through granite with extraordinary efficiency, covering distances that would seem impossible. In open air, the source would have to be deep enough and energetic enough to be heard through that much intervening stone. "What did it sound like?" I asked him. Angarak considered this for a moment. He was deliberate with language. He didn't offer the first word that came to him. He offered the accurate one. "Like someone on the other side of the wall, striking it with a hammer," he said. "Not fast, not frantic, deliberate." He paused, deliberately spaced. I told him I would keep an ear out. I told myself again, told myself firmly. The way you tell yourself something, you are working to believe that this was stone and timber physics, not mystery. By the last week of October, Hessate's 6 men on the day shift had reported hearing the knocking. Not all in the same place, not on the same days. That was the thing I could not flatten into an easy explanation, not the sound itself, but its mobility. Nowak heard it in the middle drift on a Wednesday, from beneath the floor. He had been alone in that passage, which had been briefly out of service while a new timber frame was installed at the branch point. The frame installation was complete, and Nowak had gone in ahead of the crew to inspect it. He was standing in the middle drift, running his eye along the new timbering. When the knocking came up through the floor at his feet 3 and 2 and 4, the same sequence, and he stepped back from it instinctively, the way a man steps back from a sudden heat. He told me this that same afternoon, his voice flat and controlled, the voice of a man reporting a malfunction rather than expressing fear. "Floor of the middle drift, near the new frame," he said, coming from below the floor. Below the floor of the middle drift was solid country rock. We had no workings beneath that passage. Nothing should have been below it but granite. Price told me his account on a Thursday, privately, after the rest of the men had filed out at shift's end, and the 2 of us were doing a final walk-through of the long drift. He had been loading a charge at the east wall when the knocking came from directly behind the face he was preparing to blast from inside the wall. 3 to 4 feet back from the working surface, he estimated, based on the way the sound presented. He had pressed his palm flat against the rock face, He felt a faint, regular vibration that he could not attribute to any mechanical source. Price was a powder man. He understood the behavior of rock under stress because his life depended on that understanding. He did not reach for easy explanations. It was rhythmic, he said simply, like a heartbeat that was thinking. I wrote that phrase down exactly as he said it, because I knew it was precise, even if it sounded like a poet's description rather than a miner's. Brannigan's account was the one that made me put down my inspection hammer and be still for a moment. He had heard the knocking twice in the same week, once in the main adit on a Monday, once in the long drift on a Wednesday. The second time, something had happened that he hesitated to tell me. He started toward the sound, moving along the drift toward the east wall where the knocking was emanating. He was perhaps 30 feet away from the wall when he stopped to adjust his lamp wick. The knocking stopped at the same moment he stopped walking, not faded, not tapered off. Stopped, with the abruptness of a decision. He stood still for a count of 20, watching the wall in the unsteady lamplight. Then he began walking again. 15 seconds after he resumed, the knocking resumed. He looked at me steadily when he finished. Brannigan had been underground for 30 years. He had a stillness about him that was the product of that experience. Nothing startled him, nothing rushed him. He was giving me information, not asking me to validate it. I told him to say nothing to the younger men. He nodded without comment, as if he had already made that decision. I had been keeping notes in my inspection journal since the first occurrence. I reviewed them that evening by the lamp in my boarding room. 5 separate reports. 4 different locations. The main adit left wall, the long drift south wall, the middle drift floor, the long drift east wall twice. The locations were distributed across the mine's full footprint, but the sequence was the same each time. 3 beats, pause. 2 beats, pause. 4 beats. Not always. Brannigan had reported a more complex sequence on his first occasion, but the 3-2-4 pattern appeared in every account. The mules confirmed something was wrong before any man articulated it clearly. Black Rock used 2 mules, copper and sixpence, to haul loaded ore carts from the branch point to the surface along the main adit's iron rails. They were mountain-bred animals, seasoned to the underground, unbothered by the dark, by noise, by the close confinement of stone walls on either side. Sixpence in particular was so phlegmatic that the men draped their coats over his back during lunch, and he stood motionless until they retrieved them. These were not nervous animals. They had been working this mine for 2 years without incident. In the 3rd week of October, Copper refused to pass the 60-foot mark in the main adit. He simply stopped there and could not be moved forward. We tried the usual encouragements. We tried a longer lead rope. Brannigan, who had a particular way with work animals developed over decades of mine labor, spent 20 minutes with Copper using techniques that had never failed him before. Copper stood his ground, with a rigidity that was not stubbornness, it was the locked stillness of an animal that has encountered something it will not approach. Sixpence, brought in the following morning, stopped at precisely the same point. He bled from the bit before we stopped trying to force him. The 60-foot mark was within 20 feet of where I had first heard the knocking from the dogleg wall. I switched the crew to pushing the ore carts by hand and made no public explanation for the change. In my personal journal, I wrote, "The animals know the boundary. We are past it." I wrote that on October 24th. I should have acted on it the same day. The 1st of November was a Monday. I arrived at the mine at 6:15 before the shift to run my morning inspection, a practice I had maintained since my first week at Black Rock. Walk the main adit, check the branch points, examine the timber sets for any compression or lateral movement that the previous shift might have missed, then walk the long drift to the face and assess the blast damage from the previous afternoon's charge. This inspection took me approximately 40 minutes on a normal morning. At the entrance to the dogleg, which I had checked 9 days before and found, as always, clean and undisturbed, I stopped. The floor of the dogleg had been marked. I crouched at the entrance and held my lamp low. The silt on the floor of the dogleg, which had been flat and undisturbed since September, was now scored with a trail of indentations that ran the full 40-foot length of the passage, from the back wall to where I was kneeling. I studied the marks for a long time before I touched them. They were not boot prints. They were not the round-edged impressions of a mule's hoof. They were elongated gouges, 4 in a set, each gouge 2 to 3 inches wide and pressed into the silt with enough force to pack it hard rather than merely disturb it. The 4 gouges in each set were parallel to each other and spread approximately 14 to 16 inches from outside to outside, like the span of a very large hand with the fingers extended and slightly curved. The sets alternated in their orientation left, right, at intervals of 2 to 3 feet. Whatever had made these marks had moved on all 4 limbs through a passage that was no more than 4 feet high and barely 5 feet wide. I measured each element carefully with a folding ruler I carried in my coat pocket. I spent 15 minutes at the entrance to the dogleg, recording numbers in my journal. Then I stood and walked the passage to its far end, following the marks. At the back wall, the blasted granite face where the vein had pinched out, I found the opening. It was in the lower right corner of the back wall, partly obscured by a pile of rock rubble that had been there since the original blasting. Rock fragments from the blast itself that had settled into that corner over 2 years. But the rubble had been moved. Not by a collapse, it had been pushed from the inside, displaced outward in a fan shape, as if something had pressed through from below and shoved the debris aside. The pieces were still damp where they had been displaced. The dampness meant it had happened recently. The opening itself was roughly oval, wider than it was tall, perhaps 3 feet across at its widest point and perhaps 20 inches in vertical clearance. It descended at a steep angle, perhaps 45 degrees or steeper, dropping into darkness that my lamp could not begin to penetrate. I held the lamp at the edge of the opening and watched the flame. It bent, not the subtle flex of a mine draft, a distinct, steady deflection of the flame toward me, as if the passage below was exhaling cold air upward at a constant rate. Cave breath, the breath of a connected system, deep and large enough to generate its own airflow. I put my hand into the opening. The air against my palm was cold, substantially colder than the ambient temperature of the mine, which already ran cold in November. This was the cold of deep earth, of passages far removed from any surface warmth, of a system that had not been touched by the sun in geological time. And from below that cold dark, not close but not distant either from a depth I could not estimate. I heard the knocking. 3 beats, a pause. 2 beats, a pause. 4 beats. I removed my hand from the opening and stood upright in the dogleg and was very still for a moment. I did not panic. I want to be clear about that. I experienced something more controlled and, in some ways, more frightening than panic. I experienced clarity, the sudden resolution of a pattern that had been accumulating for 2 weeks, all of it suddenly organizing itself into a single, coherent fact. The sound was coming from below. It had always been coming from below. We had been hearing it from 5 different locations, because the system beneath us was large enough that the sound could enter the mine through multiple points of contact between its roof, our floor, and our workings above. 5 locations, 1 source, something moving through passages below us, producing that sound, and the sound traveling upward through the rock. I walked out of the dogleg. I walked out of the main adit. I went to the surface and stood in the cold morning air and let it hit my face and tried to decide what I was going to do. I sealed the dogleg with a timber frame and 2 heavy planks nailed across the entrance that same afternoon, after the men had gone home. I did not explain the closure to anyone except Angarak, whom I found at his boarding house that evening, and to whom I described everything: the marks on the dogleg floor, the opening at the back wall, the cold upwelling air, the knocking from below without embellishment and without the qualifications I might have offered anyone else. Angarak was the only man whose judgment I trusted fully, and he needed the full account. He listened without interrupting. He sat at his kitchen table with his hands flat in front of him and listened to everything. Then he said, "The long drift, the east wall." Yes, the long drift's east wall, where Price had felt the vibration through his palm. If there was a passage system beneath the mine and it was large enough to generate its own air circulation, its roof would contact our workings at multiple points. The east wall of the long drift was on the south side of the mountain. The dogleg was on the west side. The middle drift floor was the upper contact point, all of it consistent with a large subterranean system running beneath us. "Something is moving through it," Angarak said. "Not a question." "Something that produces that sound," I said. "The mule stopped at 60 feet, he said. He looked at the table. "The sound is loudest nearest the dogleg. That's where it's coming through most clearly. The mules could hear it before we could." "I believe so." He was quiet for a time. Then he said the thing I'd been approaching but not quite reaching on my own. "If it's moving, Edmund, it's not moving randomly. Every report has it near the men, not near the empty passages, near wherever the men are working." I had recognized this and had been reluctant to say it. Hearing Angarak say it made it real in a different way. I pulled out my inspection journal and laid it on his table. I had marked each incident by date and location. He studied the entries without touching the journal, reading with his finger hovering above the page. 5 incidents, 4 locations. Each location was the active working area at the time of the incident. The middle drift during Nowak's frame inspection. The long drift east wall during Price's charge preparation. The long drift twice when the full crew was at the face. The main adit near the dog leg on the only afternoon I had been alone, in that section of the mine. "It's following the men," Angarak said. "It's been following us for 2 weeks. We should pull the men out," he said then. He said it plainly, without drama, the way a man states a conclusion that the evidence has made unavoidable. "Tomorrow morning." I should have agreed. I sat at Angarak's kitchen table and I came within a breath of agreeing. But I said instead that I wanted 2 more days. I wanted to trace the extent of the passage system by examining the wall contact points in each drift, to determine whether the dogleg was the only breach or whether there were others. If there were others, if the floor of the long drift or the middle drift was also compromised, that was a different situation than a single sealed point of entry. I told myself this was necessary information before we acted. Angarak looked at me for a long time. He was not a man who hid what he thought. He said, "My grandfather worked the Dolcoat, Edmund. He talked about a knacker. He said the men who heard it too long started to think it was a warning that it was telling them something was wrong in the mine. He said that was the wrong interpretation." He paused. "He said it wasn't warning them about anything. He said it was making a map." I wrote that in my journal when I got home. I wrote it word for word because I knew it mattered, even though I wasn't ready to let it matter as much as it should have. I gave myself 2 days. November 2nd, the day before, I went into the long drift alone that afternoon, an hour after the day shift ended. I brought my heaviest lamp and my inspection hammer. My intent was to walk the full length of the long drift, tapping the walls for hollow returns the way you sound out a wall, when you suspect a void behind it, working methodically from the branch point to the face, east wall and south wall both. The east wall was solid for the first 230 feet. At 240 feet from the branch point, my inspection hammer gave me a hollow return. A clear one, not the slightly duller sound of rock with a natural crack behind it, but the distinct resonant return of a significant void. I pressed my ear against the wall. The stone was cold and damp against my cheek. At first, nothing. Then a settling sound, the sound of weight shifting, of something adjusting its position on the other side of the rock. Then silence. Then the knocking. 1 knock, 3 knocks. A pause. 1 knock. I lifted my head from the wall. I stood there for a moment. Then I pressed the face of my inspection hammer flat against the stone and knocked 3 times. Slow and deliberate. 3 knocks. The silence afterward was approximately 10 seconds long. I counted them. Then, from behind the wall, 3 knocks. I walked out of the long drift at a pace that was not quite running, and I will not dress that up into anything braver than it was. I had pressed my ear to a wall in the deepest part of a Colorado silver mine, and something on the other side had listened to my knock and reproduced it exactly. Not a coincidence of timing. An answer. I had sent 3, and it had sent 3 back within 10 seconds. That is not geology. That is not timber stress. That is not any acoustic phenomenon I know of or have ever heard described. I sat in the main adit for several minutes before I trusted my legs to carry me out at a normal walk. The ventilation fan at the portal moved the air past me in its slow, mechanical rhythm. I focused on that. The fan. The rail lines running straight back into the dark. The familiar smell of wet stone and candle smoke and the faint sulfur trace of yesterday's blasting. All of it ordinary. All of it the mine I had worked in for 2.5 years. I went back to my boarding room and sat at the kitchen table until the lamp ran low. What I understood, sitting there, was this. The knocking was not a byproduct of the creature's movement. It was not incidental sound produced by a large animal making its way through stone passages. It was intentional. A deliberate, repeated percussion directed at the rock walls, directed upward, into our workings, and the creature was listening to what came back. Not to my answering knock, or not only to that, to the vibration our movements created in the rock, to the weight of our footsteps traveling down through the stone, to the mass and number and patterns of the men moving above it. The way a bat sends sound into dark air and reads the echoes, every echo a piece of information, every return signal a more complete picture of the space and everything moving through it. It had been doing this for at least 2 weeks, perhaps longer, perhaps since the first blast that compromised the partition between our workings and its passages. It knew how many of us there were. It knew where we worked and when. It knew our patterns, because our patterns are what filled the stone with vibration day after day. And the stone carried all of that down to it faithfully. And it had been reading every word. That night, I understood what Angarak's grandfather had meant. The knocking was not a warning about the creature. The knocking was the creature building a map. And by November 2nd, 1897, the map was complete. I wrote the suspension notice. I folded it and put it in my coat pocket and resolved to deliver it in the morning, November 3rd, 1897, 7 in the morning. I arrived at the mine portal at 7:05. The day shift was assembling at the dry room. I could hear the men's voices, the scrape of boots, the clatter of tools being collected. I was walking from the trail to the portal when I saw the dogleg barricade. It was in the main adit floor in pieces. Not fallen, the frame was intact, which meant it had not simply given way under its own weight or under the pressure of the stone around it. The planks had been struck from the dogleg side. They were cracked at their centers, the wood split outward along the grain, the way planks crack when something hits them from one side with concentrated force. The nails had pulled through the wood rather than pulling out of the frame. Whatever had come through had hit the planks hard, in the same approximate spot, multiple times. The wood showed 5 or 6 distinct impact points clustered in a band across the middle of each plank. I stood at the dogleg entrance. The passage beyond the broken barricade was dark and silent. The marks on the floor, the elongated claw gouges, ran through the debris and up the main adit in the direction of the working drifts. I turned and walked back toward the portal. I was perhaps 30 feet from it, walking fast, when I heard the ore cart. The sound of an iron-wheeled ore cart on iron rails is unmistakable underground. It carries and resonates, and the direction and speed are readable. This cart was moving fast, and it was moving toward the portal from somewhere in the main adit. I stepped to the side of the adit, and it came past me in a rush of displaced air, the wheels shrieking on the rails, running on its own. No man behind it, no man in front of it. Nothing driving it but the slight downward grade of the main adit, which should have been nowhere near enough to move a fully loaded cart at that speed. It hit the rail transition at the portal, left the rails, and tipped over in the yard with a crash of spilled ore and bent metal. The men came running from the dry room. Nowak was already at the portal. He had gone in before the shift. I learned this in the chaos of the next few minutes, to retrieve a measuring rod he had left at the middle drift junction. He was standing at the portal with his face the color of cold ash. He had come back through the main adit in a near run after something had passed him in the dark 40 feet from the entrance. He could not see it. His lamp was lit, and it had not illuminated it. But he had felt the displacement of air and heard the sound of it, a low, fast, scraping percussion against the floor and walls. And the ore cart had begun rolling behind him almost immediately afterward, as if whatever had struck it in passing had imparted enough force to set it moving. Something large, Nowak said. He said it quietly, not dramatically. Very large, moving low. All 14 men were now in the yard. I had the suspension notice in my coat pocket. I reached into my coat. And then the knocking came from inside the mine. It was audible from outside the portal for the first time in 6 weeks of incidents. It had always required you to be underground to hear it conducted through the rock, requiring your ear to be close to the stone. Now it was coming from inside the main adit, loud enough to reach 14 men standing in the open air of the yard. And it was not the 3-2-4 sequence. It was rapid and irregular and accompanied by a deep, rhythmic scraping. The sound of something moving fast through stone passages, its claws or its limbs striking the walls and floor and timber in a continuous low percussion, coming from the back of the mine, coming toward the portal, coming toward us. I will not reconstruct this moment in a way that makes me appear more composed than I was. I was not composed. I told the men to move to the equipment shed, to the trail, away from the portal. And some of them moved immediately, and some of them did not. The ones who did not were held in place by what the human mind does when it encounters something it has no category for. It waits. It tries to gather enough information to form a response. It waits too long. The sound grew. The timber sets inside the main adit were groaning under it, not the groan of rock stress, but the active, physical groan of framed wood being struck and compressed repeatedly as something moved past them fast. The ventilation fan's steady rhythm was lost under the sound. Then the sound stopped. Complete silence. Absolute. The kind of silence that a mind produces when every mechanical and geological sound in it ceases simultaneously, which should not be possible, which is not a natural condition, which tells your body something that your mind is still trying to process. Angarak was 3 feet to my left. He looked at me. His expression was not the expression of a frightened man. It was the expression of a man who has just had every remaining doubt removed. He said quietly enough that only I heard it. It's right there. It stopped because it knows we're here. I held my lamp up toward the portal. The flame threw its 15-foot cone of amber light into the adit's mouth. I could see the first timber sets, the rail lines running back into the dark, the rock dust on the floor disturbed in a broad swath from something that had come through it fast. At the edge of the lamplight, at the precise point where amber fades into shadow and the eye loses its grip on shape, there were 2 points of pale light, not reflecting the lamp, not catching the flame the way an animal's eyes will catch a light and throw it back bright. These were their own pale thing, the color of old bone, of clouded ice, of an eye that had traded its ability to see for something else entirely, set wide apart, low, perhaps 3 feet from the floor. They did not move. Whatever was attached to those eyes was reading us the way it had been reading us for 6 weeks, not with light, with the vibration of our breathing, our weight on the stone, the beat of our hearts through the soles of our boots into the rock. It had all the information it needed. It had had all the information it needed for a long time. It was simply waiting for the moment it had already chosen. Then it moved. I cannot tell you precisely what I saw in the next several seconds, because everything happened at a speed that outpaced my ability to process and record it simultaneously. I can tell you what I registered. An enormous low shape coming out of the shadow at a speed that belongs to things built for pursuit in total dark. Built over generations for exactly this kind of enclosed acceleration. Four-limbed, close to the floor, the shoulders the highest point, and they were not high, perhaps 4 feet at their peak. The forelegs were long, disproportionately long, ending in the curved digging claws that had left those marks in the dogleg silt. And those claws were striking the stone floor in a rapid alternating rhythm as it came that was the source of the percussive sound we had been hearing from below, magnified now and present and immediate. Its skin was the color of deep coal. Its jaw was enormous, underslung, built for something that a silver mine in Colorado had no vocabulary to describe. It came through the portal and into the yard, and the morning light did nothing to it. It did not slow or flinch in the light, because its eyes had no relationship with light that mattered anymore. And everything it needed to navigate was in the vibration of the ground under its claws. I was running before it cleared the portal. I am not ashamed of that. I am alive because of it. I turned once, 20 yards from the portal, because I heard Marsh shout and I needed to know. I held my lamp up and looked back. The creature had one of the timber supports from the portal frame in its right forelimb, and the timber was cracking in its grip the way green wood cracks, not cleanly, but in long fibrous splits under sustained compression. It was holding the timber, not as a tool, but as an obstacle being removed. Its head was turned away from me. The pale eyes, I could see them now, in the morning light, fully, finally were filmed over entirely. The clouded white of a cataract taken to its absolute conclusion, no pupil distinguishable from iris. They did not bother scanning the yard. They did not need to. Marsh had thrown his pickaxe at it. I saw the pickaxe connect with the creature's left shoulder. The creature did not react to this in any way that I could observe. It dropped the splintering timber and turned, and I turned too, and I ran. There were 5 of us inside the equipment shed when I pulled the door shut and drove the bolt, myself. Nowak, who had been first to the shed by virtue of having been first to the portal when the cart came out. George Fairley, our surface man, who maintained the stamp mill at the valley floor and had been in the yard that morning only because he'd come up the trail early to borrow a particular wrench from the equipment store. Len Holt, a mucker who had arrived late to the shift that morning and had not yet entered the mine when everything started. He had been sitting on the equipment shed steps pulling on his second boot when the cart came out. And Samuel Carver, 17 years old, our ore sorter, who had no reason to be near the portal at that hour except that he had come up the trail early and been in the wrong place at the wrong moment. 5 people, 5 of 14. We did not speak for a long time. We listened. The creature moved through the yard with a methodical deliberateness that was more frightening, in retrospect, than any kind of frantic violence would have been. We could hear it through the shed's plank walls, the slow percussion of its claws on the stone and frozen ground, the occasional deep exhalation of a large-bodied animal moving at a pace that required no particular effort. It went to the portal, then went partway inside and came out. It went to the stable at the far end of the yard. I will not describe what we heard from the stable. It went to the ore pile beside the stamp mill feed chute and was quiet there for a time, and then it moved again. It came to within 10 feet of the equipment shed and stopped. We were not breathing. I became aware that all 5 of us were holding our breath simultaneously, without having discussed or decided to do it at a collective animal response to proximity to a predator, the instinct operating below conscious thought. It stood outside the shed for approximately 3 minutes. I counted the seconds by feel. Then it moved away, toward the portal again. and the sound of it diminished gradually until only the cold morning wind in the valley was audible. Nowak broke the silence. He did it in a whisper, and what he said was not a question or an expression of fear, but a quiet observation. "It's checking." I looked at him. "It's checking each thing," he said, "making sure it's dealt with each thing." He meant it practically, not dramatically. It was the most accurate description of what we had been hearing. We waited 40 minutes after the last audible sound before Fairley opened the shed door a quarter inch and looked through the gap. He looked for a long time. Then he opened the door fully, and we walked out into the yard, all of us together, not spreading out, moving as a group the way animals that are prey move through dangerous ground. The yard was empty. The ore cart lay on its side near the trailhead. The portal frame was damaged, one support cracked through. The stable door was open. We did not look into the stable. We walked down the switchback trail to the valley road, and we did not stop walking until we reached the camp. The camp superintendent was a man named Arthur Greve, who had run mining operations in Colorado for 15 years. He was not a credulous man, and he was not a fool. I told him what had happened in the mine and in the yard, clearly and without embellishment, and he listened to all of it with an expression that moved through skepticism and into something more complex, not belief exactly, but a willingness to proceed as if what I said required a serious response. He sent a rider for the county sheriff before I had finished speaking. The sheriff organized a rescue party for the following morning. 18 men, 8 of them armed with rifles, which told me that Greve had communicated more than a bare account of the incident. They went to Black Rock Mine at first light on November 4th, and they were inside for approximately 4 hours. They found the main adit structurally sound. The timber sets were intact, except for the damaged portal frame. The rails were undamaged. The ore carts at the branch point were in their usual positions. The ventilation fan was still running. They found no 9 missing men. They found no indication of where 9 men might have gone. In the long drift, at 240 feet from the branch point on the east wall, 2 members of the rescue party reported feeling a vibration in the rock when they pressed their hands to it, which they attributed to the ventilation equipment, and which the rescue party report noted without further comment. In the dogleg, they found the broken barricade and the claw marks in the silt. The rescue party's report described these as possible evidence of large animal activity, identity unknown. They found the opening at the back of the dogleg wall, which was wider than when I had examined it 2 days prior, the rock around its edges freshly scored. The party did not enter the opening. The report noted that the passage descended at a steep angle and that cold air was rising from it. They noted that the opening appeared to communicate with a natural subterranean system of undetermined extent. They recommended the mine be sealed pending further investigation. The Black Rock Mining and Reduction Company sealed it and began liquidating its equipment the following spring without ever conducting the further investigation. The inquest ran November 15th through November 19th. I testified for 2 days. I gave the inquest the same account I've given you here, with the same level of precision. The coroner listened. He asked questions that were practical and legally focused about the structural condition of the mine, about the operational procedures on the morning of November 3rd, about whether I had any reason to believe the missing men had exited the mine through any passage other than the main portal. He did not ask me about the creature directly, though I had described it. I believe he made the decision before the testimony concluded that his report would reflect what could be legally and professionally supported, which was a mine closure under ambiguous circumstances, not a creature encounter in broad daylight in a mine yard in Garfield County, Colorado. The company accepted the inquest's conclusion. The families of the 9 missing men received settlements that were calculated on the assumption of mining accident death. The cases were closed. I submitted my resignation to the company by telegram on the morning of November 4th, before the rescue party went up the trail and never returned to the valley. Samuel Carver went back to the town he'd come from in Kansas and took a job in a dry goods store. By the last word I had of him, around 1910, he was managing the store and had married and had 2 children. He never spoke publicly about Black Rock. I cannot blame him. He was 17 years old, and he had done nothing to deserve being in that yard. Nowak stayed in Colorado for 2 more years and then returned to Pennsylvania. A mutual acquaintance told me in 1902 that he could not sleep through the night and that his wife had moved to a separate room because his nightmares disturbed the household. He had begun drinking heavily by that year, though he had not drunk before. He died of heart failure in 1911. He was 44 years old, a young man, and a healthy one when I had last worked beside him. Len Holt was dead by 1903. Alcohol in Glenwood Springs. His landlady told the coroner he hadn't slept a full night since he'd come to live in her house, and that he refused to enter any room that he couldn't see the full extent of from the doorway. George Fairley was the most durable of us. He was a practical man, and he stayed practical. He went back to surface work, went back to stamp milling, and stayed in the county for another decade. He died in 1918 of the influenza, at 53. I attended his funeral. He shook my hand at Nowak's funeral in 1911 and said, without preamble and without elaborating, "The company got the report wrong." Those were the only words he ever said to me about Black Rock after the day we walked down the trail. He said them with the certainty of a man who had no interest in debating the point, and no expectation that the record would be corrected. I want to be careful here, because this is the part where a man of my age and experience is most at risk of saying more than he knows. I will tell you what I believe, and I will mark clearly the line between what I observed and what I have concluded from it over 28 years of consideration. What I observed: a creature of very large size, adapted to subterranean life, to the point that its eyes had become vestigial. Moving on, all 4 limbs in a low, fast posture consistent with navigating passages that could not accommodate an upright stance. Equipped with elongated forelimbs ending in heavy curved claws built for rock, not for digging soil, for moving through stone. A jaw of disproportionate size relative to even a large terrestrial predator. Skin the color of deep coal. No reaction to lamplight. No reaction to a thrown pickaxe striking its shoulder. Moving and responding with a deliberateness that belongs to intelligence, not instinct. What I concluded: this animal had not wandered into the passages beneath Black Rock Mine recently. It was resident there. Its body was the product of an adaptive process that takes far longer than any human record extends the complete atrophying of functional vision, the development of claws that speak to generations of life in stone, the pale coloration of absolute permanent dark. This was not a bear, not any member of the mustelid or ursid families, not anything catalogued in any natural history text I have encountered in the years since, and I've looked. The knocking was echolocation used against solid rock rather than open air. The creature struck the stone walls and floor of its passages and read the returns the way those returns changed when mass moved above them, when weight shifted, when the number of bodies in a given section of the mine changed. It had been doing this since at least October 19th when I first heard it, and almost certainly for much longer than that. We had simply not been close enough to a contact point between our workings and its passages to hear it until the dogleg brought us within range. It tracked us by this method, 5 locations over 2 weeks, each location corresponding to wherever the men were working at the time. That is not coincidence. It was methodical information gathering, using the mine's own stone as a medium, with a patience and consistency that speaks to a kind of cognition I am not qualified to categorize, but am entirely unwilling to dismiss. The mules understood before we did. Their refusal to pass the 60-foot mark was not stubbornness, and it was not malfunction. It was sensory information, the knocking, transmitted through the stone floor, audible to them at a frequency or intensity that human hearing was not registering at that distance. They were telling us what they knew. We replaced them with men who could be reasoned with. which is to say men who could be convinced to override what their bodies were telling them. And we called this a management decision. I sealed the dogleg barricade 2 days before the incident. The creature broke through it that same night. The barricade was not a sufficient barrier. I knew this when I built it, and I told myself it was a temporary measure while I gathered more information. The truth is that I did not want to stop the operation. The ore was running well. We had a tonnage commitment, and I'd been telling myself for 2 weeks that I was dealing with an anomaly rather than a threat, because an anomaly is a problem for a mine foreman, and a threat of the kind I was beginning to understand would have required me to do something that I was not prepared to do. I was not prepared to walk into the superintendent's office and say, "There is something living under this mine, and it is tracking our men, and we need to evacuate." I knew what that would sound like. I was afraid of sounding like that. That fear cost 9 men their lives, and I have carried that knowledge every day for 28 years, and I expect to carry it every day I have left. There is one document I have not mentioned until now, which I have kept in my personal papers since the inquest, and which I am including in this account because it belongs here. Among the company records made available to me during the inquest proceedings, I found a letter dated March 14th, 1890, 7 years before the incident, 3 years before full operations commenced at Black Rock. It was written by Callum Hess, the original prospector, to the company's initial Denver investor group, and it concerned the quality and extent of the ore body he had located. In the 3rd paragraph, Hess wrote the following. I copied it into my journal word for word. I should note that the Ute in this valley did not prospect this hillside, despite the ore-bearing quartz being visible on the exposed face. I made inquiries of one of their number, a man with sufficient English to converse, and he said only that the mountain was already taken. When I pressed him, he said there were things below that did not share, and that the valley had been left alone. For that reason, he offered nothing further, and did not appear to believe further explanation was required. I include this observation only for completeness, and do not suggest it should factor into your investment considerations. The Ute had known. They had known for long enough that it had passed into the kind of knowledge that does not require explanation to those who share it. The knowledge encoded in the decision not to go somewhere, in the phrase left behind for anyone who asked. The mountain was already taken, not by a prior claim, not by a competing operation, but by something that was there before any human being had thought to look at the ore-bearing quartz on that hillside and imagine a profit in it. Callum Hess found no legal competing claim. He was correct about that. He was wrong about everything it meant. The 9 men whose names belong in this account are Thomas Angarak, 43, Daniel Price, 38, Hector Brannigan, 51, Hector Marsh, 22, Alexei Nowak's cousin Pyotr, 29, who had been with us only since September and to whom I had not paid enough individual attention during his weeks on the crew, Robert Kane, James Ferris, Martin Voss, Owen Trevithick, who was Cornish, whose grandfather had worked the Dal Coath, and who had grown up with the same stories about knockers that Angarak had grown up with and that I had grown up with. I do not know whether Owen Trevithick understood, in whatever time he had, what the knocking had been. I find I cannot decide whether understanding would have been better or worse than not understanding, and I have stopped trying to decide. The mountain at Black Rock is still there. The sealed portal, I'm told, is still intact, or was, as of some years ago, when a man from the county surveyor's office mentioned it in passing. What the intervening years have done to the timber bulkhead is not something I know. What condition the passage system beneath it is in, whether its occupant remains in the same range or has moved, whether the passage system connects to other valleys, other mountains, other places where men have or have not thought to dig, I do not know. I am not able to know, and I have made my peace with not knowing. What I know is the thing I have been trying to say clearly since the first line of this account. We thought we were operating a mine. We were operating in the ceiling of something else's home. We knocked on its floor for 6 years with our blasting and our drilling and our daily movement. And eventually it knocked back. And the knocking, which we heard as a warning, as a geological anomaly, as a mystery to be investigated on our own schedule at our own convenience, was none of those things. The knocking was how it found us. It had found us completely, weeks before we understood it was looking. And when it finally came up through the floor of our mind on the morning of November 3rd, 1897, it was not responding to us the way a startled animal responds to a sudden intrusion. It was doing what any reasonable occupant of a territory does when an intrusion has gone on long enough, and the intruders have failed to understand every signal they have been given. It was ending it. We were the ones who had knocked first. We had been knocking for 6 years. Every blast, every drill, every loaded cart rolling down the rails above its head, all of that was us. Announcing ourselves, announcing our numbers and our patterns, and our confidence that the mountain was ours to take. The creature below had listened to all of it with an intelligence and a patience that I cannot fully credit even now. And it had answered us in the only language it had. And we had heard the answer and called it folklore and geology and something to be investigated later. There is nothing left to investigate. The boundary was always there. It ran not between legal claims on a map, not between one man's stake and another's, but between the surface of the world and the deep interior of it, between the part that belongs to daylight and the part that was formed in permanent dark and has never had any relationship with daylight at all. We crossed that boundary with our first blast in 1891, and we spent 6 years on the wrong side of it without knowing it. And when the thing that owned that side finally enforced it, we were surprised. We should not have been surprised. We had been told. The mules knew. The Ute knew. Angarak's grandfather knew. And I knew, by the end of October, well before I was willing to act on it. The mountain is still there. The deep passages beneath it do not appear on any survey. They have never been charted. They connect, based on the airflow and the acoustics and the scale of what I briefly saw, to a system far more extensive than the 40-foot side passage we accidentally breached. How far that system extends, and what else moves through it, and what other mines and shafts and adits have been driven into its ceiling. In the years since Black Rock closed, these are questions I'm not able to answer. They are questions I think about. Every time I hear, in the deep quiet of a night when the house has settled and the wind has dropped and there is nothing between me and the silence, the sound of something slow and rhythmic and deliberate coming from somewhere below the floor, I think about them. It is probably the house settling. Probably. Edmund Reese, former assistant mine foreman, Black Rock Mining and Reduction Company, Garfield County, Colorado. Dictated in November 1925. Transcribed by his granddaughter, Clara Reese, at his request and from his personal journals, which she retained. He passed the following February without amendment or retraction. The journals are in private family possession. This account has not been previously published.